It was 1999. I was sitting in my first ministerial meeting in a beautiful laid-back town, metropolis of Smithers, British Columbia. Population huge, population maybe 5,000 in the surrounding area. I had just recently moved there, for I was hired as the lead pastor, the associate pastor, the children's ministry pastor, the youth pastor, the family pastor, the administration pastor. Well, pretty much the only guy. And I was sitting in this ministerial meeting, and if you're unfamiliar with ministerial, it's essentially where the leaders of the churches or the pastors come and they gather together, often once a month, to share what's going on in the community and help each other out and let each other know how they're doing, and accountability and relationship building, and learn how to work together as churches for the sake and betterment of the community. And we were sitting in this meeting, and I was slowly getting to know each of these individuals, because it was my first meeting. And then the chairperson that was leading it said, okay, time to come to order. They prayed, and they said, okay, the first item of business, and the name Brian Richard was said. And as soon as that name was said, out of the corner on the one side of me, I heard simply something like this: run that bum out of town. What? What did you say? I didn't have to wait too long. I didn't have to ask that individual to repeat it. They said it louder a second time. Brian Richard, run that bum out of town. So I thought, well, who in the world is Brian Richard? Didn't have to wait too long for that either, for that comment was made pretty quick. Brian Richard, he was new to the town, probably had been there a little longer than I had. Apparently, Brian Richard was born in 1958 in Long Beach, California. He had moved to Smithers, where he had told many Canadians that he had worked as a cop. Sometimes he had investigated cattle and things that went on with cattle. He also said that he had been shot. In fact, while he was investigating cattle. And so because he had been shot and some of the complications from it, he had to leave the police force. At the Smithers Fitness Northwest Gym, where he often would come, and Brian would work out, where he would loudly pronounce how much he could bench lift and loudly do grunts where he said, "Look at me." He often claimed that he worked with Hulk Hogan, if any of you remember that name, or Arnold Schwarzenegger, and spent time with them. He liked to walk around town, and he wore a hat that said, "The property of Jesus." He would like to, wherever he could, tell people that he was the property of Jesus. If you met him, he would tell you his life story in 30 seconds. That he had been in film business in Mexico. That he had worked on Conan the Barbarian Adventure series. That he had even worked with Chuck Colson's prison ministry. He had been a millionaire several times. And it went on and on and on. In fact, he liked to impress people, especially women, because he liked to go out with women. He would go to the churches and get to know many of the single women. And so as this was being said around the table at the ministerial meeting, I was slowly getting a picture of who this Brian Richard was. And Don, one of the pastors, repeated again, "Run that bum out of town." We're coming into 2 Peter, and we've been going through it over the last little while. And the privilege of that. And 2 Peter has a lot with it. And if you have followed along with this series and continue to follow along, there's kind of an overview to it. The theme of 2 Peter really follows false teachers and scoffers of Christ, those who would love to lead the church astray. And in chapter 1, it actually starts off, Peter starts off, he writes this letter to many to remind the church of who they're called to, of their security in the promises of God, of their final destiny, Then in chapter 2, which we began last week, it talks more about the false teachers than those who come in and try to rip away your call, rip away your security, rip away your closeness to Christ. Try to tell you there's something more than what Christ offers, that you don't have enough. And in chapter 3, which we'll look at in the next coming little while, Peter wants to remind them, after telling them some of the challenges within the church that he sees and he's been told about, which we'll look at today. He reminds them again that the Lord will be coming, that the promises of the Lord will be fulfilled. He reminds them to stand strong, stand steadfast. And he also gives some predictions of what will happen to those who try to rip the church apart. So we come back, and today we are in 2 Peter chapter 2, verses 10 to 16. And we're going to simply look at the idea of a Christian con, as I've called it. A new con, the church con, yet an old problem. A con. Do you know what a con is? A con, verb-wise, is to persuade someone, to con someone, to help them to believe in something. And it's typically done by the use of deception. A little bit of lying. A little bit of stretching the truth to get your own way. But a Christian con, as a noun, is an insistence of deceiving or tricking someone. So they're a con artist. And today, Peter and God want us to look at the church and look at in a mirror and say, do we, who is the Christian con? So who is this Christian con? Let's read together. 2 Peter chapter 2. We're going to read starting at verse 1 and then down to verse 16. And it says this: "But there were also false prophets in Israel, just as there will be false teachers among you. They will cleverly teach destructive heresies and even deny the master who brought them. In this way they will bring sudden destruction on themselves. Many will follow their evil teaching and shameful immorality. And because of these teachers, the way of truth will be slandered. In their greed, they will make up clever lies to get a hold of your truth and your money. But God condemned them long ago, and their destruction is not delayed. For God did not spare even the angels who sinned. He threw them into hell, in the gloomy pits of darkness, where they are being held until the day of judgment." Verse 5, "And God did not spare the ancient world, except for Noah and the 7 others in his family. Noah warned the world of God's righteous judgment. So God protected Noah and when he destroyed the world of ungodly people with a vast flood. Later, God condemned the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah and turned them into heaps of ashes. He made them an example of what will happen to ungodly people. But God also rescued Lot out of Sodom because he was a righteous man who was sick of the shameful immorality of the wicked people around him. Yes, Lot was a righteous man who was tormented in his soul by the wickedness he saw and heard day after day." So you see, the Lord knows how to rescue godly people from their trials, even while keeping their wicked under punishment until the day of final judgment. Now we come to verse 10, where we're looking at today. "He is especially," that's God, "is especially hard on those who follow their own twisted sexual desire and who despise authority. These people are proud and arrogant, daring even to scoff at supernatural beings without so much even as trembling. But the angels, who are far great in power and strength, do not dare to bring from the Lord a charge of blasphemy against those supernatural beings. These false teachers are like unthinking animals, creatures of instinct, born to be caught and destroyed. They scoff at things they do not understand, and like animals, they will be destroyed. Their destruction is their reward for the harm they have done. They love to indulge in evil pleasures in broad daylight. They are a disgrace and a disdain among you. They delight in deception, even as they eat with you in your fellowship meals. They commit adultery with their eyes, and their desire for sin is never satisfied. They lure unstable people into sin, and they are well trained in greed. They live under God's curse. They have wandered off the right road and followed the steps of Balaam, son of Beor, who loved to earn money by doing wrong. But Balaam was stopped from his mad course when his donkey rebuked him with a human voice. Simply for our time this morning, we want to look at what happens when my godless desire dominates. Who is this con man? Who is this con woman? Peter seems to pull back, and he's writing a letter to Christians, to the churches that he listens to, that he talks with, and he gets this sense, he is told that there's these people in their churches that are con artists, that are following their desires, their godless desires. So for a moment, we're going to look at that and reflect upon that. So one, what are the characteristics? What is the picture of a Christian con? What is the characteristics of a desire-dominated person? Again, it says here in verse 10 and 11, he's very clear. He says, he is especially, that's God again, hard on those who follow their own twisted sexual desires, who despise authority. These people are proud and arrogant, daring even to scoff at supernatural beings without so much as trembling. But the angels, who are far greater in power and strength, do not dare to bring from the Lord a charge of blasphemy against those supernatural beings. So who are these cons? Who are these, as they would call them, false teachers? What are their characteristics? And it says two things. Notice this. It says, one, they are dominated by desires. It says here in verse 10, they have the lusts of the flesh, twisted sexual desires. In fact, they're unashamed in their desires. It also talks about their love for money in this passage. It's not just about the sex and the feeling part, but it's also the love for money. It says here that they were well trained in greed, verse 14. In other words, they were the well trained is you exercise. You're exercising for something. You're working out towards something, and these people would exercise intentionally, daily. They would exercise so they could have the most money they could possibly get. In fact, verse 14, it also says they would lure other people. They would go after them. They lusted after their desires. They loved money. They wanted money. But it also talked about their desires for sex, for adultery. It says here that they committed adultery with their eyes. They were never satisfied. They went after, and not only did they go after people, but they also led people to go after people. They were desire dominated. The other thing it says here in verse 10 is that they actually despised authority. So not only did they let their feelings dominate what they did and how they operated, not the truth, which we talked about in chapter 1, and a little bit last time in beginning of chapter 2. But they also went after, they despised authority. In other words, they were all about themselves. They were the ones in charge. They were self-sufficient. It actually uses the word proud here. In other words, they were presumptuous. They were bold. They never lacked humility. Do you know anybody like this? They lack humility. It is always about them first. It's their desires first. They're the ones that don't listen. It says here they're proud, they're bold, they're brash. They seem to have all the answers. But not only that, it actually says they're also arrogant here. In other words, they're self-willed. In other words, their will comes first. They are self-pleasing. They have no idea what to do other than to please themselves. That's what this word means here. It's all about them all of the time and what they want. They despise authority. They don't want God's authority. They don't want the church's authority. This person here is not afraid. It's interesting. It says he scoffs. He's not afraid to challenge. He's not afraid to speak evil against, to slander. That's what scoff means here. He disrespects those in authority. And he does so without trembling in fear. In fact, nothing will keep this individual from doing what they want to do. They are brutally determined to go their own way. They have no regard for human appeal or divine guidance. And he even brings in here a little interesting comment about the angels. Do you notice that? It's like he has no regard, or she has no regard for the spiritual world. That's what he's getting at here. For angels who have more power, more wisdom, greater strength than that individual, they could care less. It means nothing to them. To him or her, the spiritual world does not exist, or at least he doesn't listen to it. He is blind and deaf to heaven, no matter what heaven says. These are characteristics of the Christian con. God is not number one. You know, I'm trying to think of what this might look like in reality. And as I was thinking about that, I'm pondering, this passage talks a lot about animals and whatnot. So I was looking up different animals, and I happened to come across an article written a few years ago about the characteristics of a cat. Now, I have owned a cat I was supposed to own the cat for 1 month, and I owned it for 2 weeks. So I may not be long enough, 2 weeks, to be an authority on having a cat, but it was certainly long enough, I think, to have an opinion about cats. And I looked at this study, and maybe you have too. Maybe you love cats right now. Maybe you don't love cats. We're not going to get into that. But this study from the researchers of the University of South Australia and of the University of Wellington in New Zealand, so I'm not making this stuff up, they sought to determine the personality of cats. And so they studied 2,802 cats. And in all of their analysis, they came up with this. So bear with me for a second. They came up with this. There are 5 reliable factors that depict the domestic cat's personality. So what did they learn? What did they say about cats? This is what they came up with. Cats are, first of all, this is not good. Neurotic, or they use the word neuroticism. Oh, that's working on my English there. Neuroticism. So cats are neurotic. And so they used words to describe this neuroticism. And it says simply this: reflects the traits of insecurity. A cat has anxiousness. A cat is fearful of people. A cat often is suspicious of people or things that are around her. A cat often is shy and actually wants nothing to do. So I thought for a minute, It sounds for a moment like a cat despises authority, wants its own things, wants its own control, is insecure of everything else but themselves. Second thing they said is a cat has dominance. In other words, it includes a cat has no problem in being a bully. A cat has no problem in being aggressive towards other cats. Boy, that sure sounds a lot like a desire that a cat has is to dominate. Not just despise authority, but desire to dominate others. A cat also has impulsiveness, it said. The third trait. In other words, it is reckless. It does what it wants. It's erratic. What desire is this? Sounds like a cat desires, again, to dominate. Then it has an extra aversion. It wants to, in other words, be active. It wants to be vigilant. It wants to be curious. It wants to be inquisitive. It wants to be inventive. It thinks it's smart. That's what cats are. Here we go. Sounds a lot like it has a desire to dominate. The personality of an individual cat, they continue to say, is often influenced by those who are around it. Its culture. In other words, where it lives. In other words, who its owners are. Now, I'm not going anywhere near that one. I'm not going anywhere near that one. But it almost sounds like a cat is like a con, isn't it? Now, you may notice that I only gave you 4 traits. That's because I think there actually is hope for cats. And it's this 5th one. And the last one is cats tend to be, in all of the research, have a sense of agreeableness. In other words, they can be affectionate if they want to. They can be friendly to people if they want to. They can be gentle if they want to. So there is hope for cats. There is also hope for the Christian con. We'll look at that in a minute. But be aware of the Christian con. Be aware of the characteristics of a Christian con. A Christian con simply wants to dominate. They follow their desire to dominate. Not only that, but they also follow their desire to despise authority. They want to be in control. They want to be in charge. So once Peter brings that out, he says, okay, well, let's look at the results. So if this is who may be in our churches, what are the results? And he comes into the second part here, verse 12 to 16, and it says this: "These false teachers are like unthinkable animals, creatures of instinct, born to be caught and destroyed. They scoff at things they do not understand, and like animals, they will be destroyed. Their destruction is their reward for the harm they have done. They love to indulge in evil pleasures in broad daylight. They are a disgrace and a stain among you. They delight in deception, even as they eat with you in your fellowship. They commit adultery with their eyes. Their desire for sin is never satisfied. They lure unstable people into sin, and they are well trained in greed. They live under God's curse. They have wandered off of the right road and follow the footsteps of Balaam, son of Beor, who loved to earn money by doing wrong. But Balaam was stopped from his mad course when his donkey rebuked him with his human voice." So what's in store for the individual who lets his or her desires dominate them? Isn't that what some of our challenge is? We see people, maybe even in our own churches, we struggle with them. We struggle with their domination. We struggle with their lack of authority to Christ. And we wrestle with that. In fact, maybe over this COVID time, we've seen desires pop up. And maybe it's not about us. Maybe it's about us, not other people. And we see the desires we have as we don't meet together as much as a church body. And maybe we have a desire selfishly for our things. It's easier for us to walk away because we don't have that accountability of coming together and worshiping together. Is our desire to be drawn closer to our Master? That's from chapter 1, Jesus Christ. Is our desire to learn about his truth? Is our desire to recognize and respond his rescuing? Verse 9 here of chapter 2. Do we have respect for his authority? Do we have respect for God's judgment? What happens when we don't? Last week we looked a little bit at God's judgment. God continues a little bit on today. What is in store for the church who ignores the individuals who let their desires dominate them? What is in store? Verse 12 and 16, it seems to be fairly clear. What happens to these individuals? They get all twisted. It actually compares them to wild beasts. Like wild beasts, they are slaves to their instincts and born simply to be slaughtered. When you go after, when your desires and you follow your desires that aren't going towards Christ, aren't drawing you closer to him, they draw you to other things like sexual desires, like walking away from authority and walking away from God's control. It says that they will land you in ruin. They will destroy you. Verse 12 and 13, these individuals will be destroyed. Destruction is their end. They live under God's curse. And then, in fact, they talk about Balaam here, which is a great example. If you haven't read the story in Numbers chapter 22, Balaam is this seer. He's this person that apparently could tell and give blessings or curses on communities. And there must have been some truth to that. Because a king comes along, the king, his name is Balak, and he comes along and he sees the nation of Israel who has come and has wandered from Egypt, and they've come along and they've come to his property, which is the kingdom of Moab. And he sees this, and his people see this, and they're afraid of Israel. So this king, Balak, turns to Balaam or sends him a note and says, I want you to curse this nation of Israel. And in conversations in a few chapters, you see this back and forth with God and Balaam and Balaam and Balak. And so Balaam is summoned by Balak, and so he decides to go to Balak, who's going to pay him for his advice. And we learn that Balaam loves the money, and that's why it's brought up here, right? He loves the money. He can't wait to be paid. He's going to give advice, blessings or curses. I'll leave you to read the story of what happens. But along this way, he's riding a donkey, and the donkey stops him and talks to him. And the reason the donkey stops him is because there's an angel in the way, and that angel is God. It's an angel of God, and God is going to destroy Balaam. And he tries to go around him, and Balaam tries to go take his donkey in a different way, and each path gets stopped. And eventually the donkey just like kneels down, goes down, and Balaam starts beating it. And then as he's beating it, the donkey turns to Balaam and says, what are you doing? In fact, it's the voice of God speaking out. He says, I have stopped you from being destroyed. And at that moment, God opened up the eyes of Balaam, and he sees in front of him the angel of the Lord with a sword to end life. God was going to take his life that day, but the donkey stopped. The reward for desired domination. Balaam couldn't wait to go and collect his money. He couldn't wait to get his riches from the king. The reward for our desires, for following our desires apart from God, it says here, lead to destruction. In other words, decay, ruin, corruption, physically and spiritually. And Peter's trying to remind the church of that. He's trying to probably shock the church to help them understand, to help them see the bigger picture. Verse 14, it says here, the desire for sin is never satisfied. With these individuals, these cons, they can't stop. It says here, they commit adultery with their eyes. In other words, every woman they see or every person they see, they can't wait to have some sort of sexual relationship with them. And it's just non-stop. That's how it comes out. But not only that, it just says they cannot be satisfied. There's this constant need for more and more for satisfaction. They lose the thrill, so they need more and more. Have you discovered this? In your desires, when you walk away from the Lord, do you find yourself feeding on your desires, but you can't get enough? And so you'll almost do anything to get more and more of it? And God says, through Peter and to us, it's time to stop. Because it just leads to destruction. Not only that, it says they're actually well-trained in greed. So it's not just about what they see, and it's not just about indulging in the physicalness of it. It's also about wanting more. As I mentioned earlier, it's like an athlete exercising for the games. It says here that they lure other people, unstable people, into sin. It's like a lure. Are you fishermen here? Fisherwoman? Do you guys like to fish? It's the lure. What are lures for? It's to catch the fish. So they make them all shiny. They act just right because they want the fish to nap on. And he says that's what cons do. That's what going after your desires do. That's what walking away can do. Those desires try to grab a hold of people and pull other people away from the truth and from Christ. They deliberately do this. It's intentional. How many of us wish that people who are like this in our churches would stop, or in our communities would stop? That if they would just keep to themselves, but they don't, they actually go after other people. They lure them. There were people in the church who were doing this, and they couldn't stop them, or they didn't stop them. There were people in the church who led others away from Jesus Christ. As chapter 2, verse 1 says, they led them to deny the master who bought them with his sacrifice. This is what happens. These are the results of what happened if we follow these desires that pull us away from Christ. So, bottom line, what's the hope? What hope do we have? Verse 16 here, I love it. But Balaam was stopped from his mad course when his donkey rebuked him with a human voice. There is hope for the Christian con. There is hope for the church. God can step in miraculously and make things happen. I can't imagine what Balaam, other than his anger, I can understand that because I get frustrated at my desires and following my desires when I can't get them, when I can't continue in them. Have you been there? Are you there with me sometimes? Have you seen others get upset? Can you imagine you're upset and all of a sudden this dumb animal that is not supposed to speak turns its head and looks at you and talks to you? Only God can do that. Our hope is that there are times where God breaks into our world and does something that is not ordinary and gets our attention, or gets the attention of the Christian con. And he does this in this instant. And that's awesome. Yay, God. Revelation chapter 2, we don't have time to look at it, other than I will read the verses in chapter 20 to 23. And John's talking to a church, and that church is in Thyatira. And he says this in verse 20. If we think that Peter's just talking to one church, that there are random churches, that there are very few churches with cons in them and challenges like Peter's talking about, he says this in verse 20. But I have this complaint against you. So this is Jesus looking at the church in this place. And he says this: you are permitting that woman, that Jezebel who calls herself a prophet, to lead my servants astray. She's teaching them to commit sexual sin and to eat food offered to idols. Sounds similar. Therefore, I will throw her on a bed of suffering, and those who I gave her time, verse 21, to repent, but she does not want to turn away from her immorality. Therefore, I will throw her on a bed of suffering, and those who commit adultery with her will suffer greatly unless they repent and turn away from their evil deeds. I will strike her children dead, then all the churches will know that I am the one who searches out the thoughts and intentions of every person, and I will give you exactly what you deserve. You want hope? God looks at each of our churches. God looks at each of our lives. God looks at each of our hearts, and he sees through, and he sees our intentions, and he puts things in the way to stop them. And he puts things and opportunities in the way to repent and to turn. Sadly, some don't. In fact, beginning of chapter 2 here, we have the example of Noah. We have the example of Lot, of Noah and Lot, who were righteous people and repented and returned. And they were called righteous because they drew closer to God. They followed God. They loved God. And yet we have a whole lot of people who didn't. And they got the judgment that God gave them. What or who is God using to speak to you right now? What is the master, our master, God, saying to us right now? Are we drawing closer to our desires, or are we drawing closer to Him? Is our desire Him, to be with Christ? His journey is full of mercy. My journey with Him is full of repentance. His journey is full of sacrifice. My journey with Him is full of His acceptance of Him. His journey is about control, and He leads. My journey with Him is about humility and walking in humility, accepting control. His journey, His closeness to Him is about His will, and my closeness to Him is about my obedience to Christ. That's the journey. That's the direction. Brian Richards. Brian Richards had a W5 actually came up and did a piece on Brian Richards years ago. And this is what they wrote. A con man for Christ was the headline. The little town of Smithers had never seen anyone like Brian Richards, a woman-chasing, net-scamming evangelist who told his radio audience often, "The fact I get up in the morning means I sin." And sin he did. He would often say, "Until the next time, this is Brian Richards, the rock jock who spins for Jesus, saying, 'Gotta love you, because he's the daddy.'" Smithers, a few people here still have a kind word for the way he rocked for Jesus on his Christian Power Hour radio show. But most just sadly shake their heads in memory of the Christian hipster in ever-present sunglasses who roared into town in the spring of '99, tossing out Bible passages and can't-lose deals faster than Lexus and Mercedes. He claimed to own these things in California. Brian Richards, whose real name turned out to be Richard Brian Menard. He was a smooth-talking, weightlifting, internet surfing evangelical, most recently from Los Angeles, who had been long evading police hunts in the U.S. He finally met his match in a town he liked to put down as Hicksville, Canada. Menard told everyone in Smithers they could trust him because he was a Christian. While comforting people with lines like, "Don't despair, God's always there," Menard had a complex operation running out of Canada, hustling people from Vancouver to California, Illinois to Idaho. He sold timeshares in resorts he didn't own, vacation and wilderness packages he never paid for, and Christian music recording sessions that never happened. He ran a dubious Christian dating scheme and pirated music for his Christian Power Hour, which he used to make connections and money. This is not to mention harassing women and threatening to at least beat up one man. Brian Richards left a legacy. But Smithers Ministerial and the churches saw the con because they knew the truth, because they walked with Christ. And they had enough, and they stood up, especially Don, who wanted to run the bum out of town. Two U.S. investors also had enough and stood up. And that's when the investigation began. The con man's desires caught up with him, and he was put in prison. What are the desires that you are following? In a moment during communion, we'll come face to face with the reminder of God's costly love for you and I, for us. What does this selfless love do to my selfish following of my desires?